Acknowledgements. This book is the product of other people's goodwill, effort, and trust. The outpouring of support from my family and friends, sources, and even from strangers convinced me early on that this story was going to be told. All I had to do was go where it led me. Ever since the notion of writing a book popped into my head, my cousin Cliff Green has been my faithful facilitator, guide, and host. Cliff's enthusiasm overwhelmed his usual good judgment, and he offered to let me stay in his spare room in Heppner while I did my research. I shamelessly accepted that hospitality at least half of the time for close to 3 years, and I receive his ready assistance and wise counsel to this day. Without Cliff's support, there would be no book. My brother and sister-in-law, Bob and Tammy Green in Pendleton, made a similar mistake and found me in my laptop and notebooks cluttering up their home many of the days that I wasn't at Cliff's for the same 3 years and beyond. It is impossible to repay such gifts. Others in my family have been unfailingly generous with time, expertise, histories, and suggestions. Margaret Green, MD, helped me understand the public health issues and medical problems that challenged survivors after the flood. Marion and Marlis Green taught me the Heppner they'd lived in, and Steve Green, Tom Green, and Beverly McCaleb Tobias provided leads and valuable ideas. Our aunt, Ruth Green McCaleb, and her husband, Omer, were always available with information, records, experiences, and insight. They provided all of that after they had innocently instigated this project by showing me the Heppner Gazette-Times report of the flood centennial observance in 2003. That news story was the catalyst for my flood introduction trip to Heppner and the discovery of Mark Heiberger's book, Days of Sorrow. Howard Bryant, my father's cousin, and his wife Beth were my first sources, and for 4 years they have been my steady champions. Together they hold the record for sitting still for my interviews, and they have repeatedly shared boxes of newspapers and decades of recollections and all the encouragement a person could want. Catherine Hoskins is one of the stalwarts of the Morrow County Historical Society and the daughter of flood survivor Gertrude Crawford Parker. Catherine found information, letters, and photos and volunteered assistance again and again and again. Betty Carlson drove me on a tour of Lexington and Ione and provided background on the typhoid victims there. Kit George, whose grandfather, Bert Sigsbee, took so many of the pictures in these pages, loaned me the contents of his photo trunk, and his wife, Shirley George, arranged handoffs and added more history and more hospitality. My friend Rich Frischman, photographer and artist extraordinaire, selected, restored, and edited the photos I received from Kit, the museum, and families, and tutored me in photographic storytelling. Pat Struthers of Heppner expertly scanned dozens of old pictures. Judy Stanley, news artist at the Herald in Everett, Washington, created the maps, skillfully weaving in important elements of the story. Bob Jones shared 1903 documents and a wealth of knowledge about Morrow County history and weather. Stephen Gillespie and Marie Rose Wong are responsible for our knowledge of the Chinese men who worked and died in Heppner. Reverend Grace Drake compiled for me the flood references in the Bible and shared information on women's roles in early-day Oregon and her own Morrow County experiences. Sarah Little and Virginia Roberts unearthed volumes of information about the people who died in or survived the flood. David DeMeo, Heppner City Manager, and Casey Beard, Morrow County Emergency Management Director, each went out of his way to help. At the Morrow County Courthouse, I enjoyed the assistance of County Clerk Bobby Childers, County Assessor Greg Sweek, Judge Terry Tallman, County Commissioner Ray Grace, and the entire staff of the Circuit Court, who courteously let me into the basement vaults day after day and hiked back down to lock up behind me. Heppner native Bob Bryant was an early, generous source. Pat Sweeney shared June 1903 San Francisco newspapers and rare photographs. I went to see Heppner native Francis Cox Griffin in Salem, Oregon, for an hour and spent a day going through her records, photos, and memorabilia. Lloyd Stywig, Oregon Grand Master of IOOF, looked up and sent me the lodge records about the flood. Tom Robinson of the Historic Photo Archive in Portland devoted days to locating and attempting to copy pictures he and I hoped would deepen this report. Virginia George Nairns connected me with her historic All Saints Memorial Episcopal Church and with Willow Creek Terrace assisted living residents who actually lived local history. Ray Walden of West Consultants explained the engineering study his company did for a FEMA flood insurance review. Ken Hunziker, retired engineer, interpreted the 1903 USGS reports on the flood after his son, Scott Hunziker, enlisted him to this cause. Dr. William Rentz translated weather reports and maps and explained the storm that caused the Heppner Flood. I acted like the Morrow County Museum in Heppner was my personal office every other week for 3+ years. This volunteer-operated facility is the treasury where I found the letters, records, and books, family files, photos, and microfilm that are the foundation for so much of this book. Besides Cliff Green, I am especially indebted to 3 other people affiliated with the museum: Larry Mills, Kay Proctor, and Robin Krebs. Cindy Breidenbach, a museum volunteer, was searching the files for me one more time when she got sick and died too young. For vital research help, my thanks to Arlene Wallace of the Population Resource Center at Portland State University, Susan Caron of the National Archives in Seattle, Jenny Watts, curator of the photographs at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, Bonnie Weiderberg and Deborah Ward at the Oregon Department of Human Services Public Health Division, David Merrill at the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association, and Sandra Rowe and Marjorie Helton at the Oregonian. Megan Friedel, Catherine M. Knotson, and Lucy Berkeley at the Oregonian Historical Society, Tim Gleason, Journalism Dean at the University of Oregon, Marilyn Lohman, hydrologist with the National Weather Service in Pendleton, and Robert W. Ford of the Corps of Engineers. Janice Crowley's grandparents lived just south of Heppner in June 1903 and wrote about that afternoon and the days that followed. Janice volunteered the memoirs of George J. and Jenny Forbes Curran and did additional research to round out their substantial contribution to this story. Glenn Miller and Leighton Wood could not have been more helpful. Glenn sent the powerful letter written after the flood by their grandmother, Cora Phelps, and both cousins agreed I could quote from it. Britt and Cynthia Bambick located and scanned the Phelps wedding portrait. Everything we know about John Stein, the Portland banker who died in the Heppner Flood, is the gift of Mark and Rosemary Stein, who also shared the photos of John and the family left behind. Storm Yonix, granddaughter of Robert Hind, allowed me to quote from her family history and readily provided photos of the Hind family victims. Time and again, I discovered support from people I didn't know. Carlisle Harrison was one. So was John Fraser of Pilot Rock. Peg Willis, Pendleton fiddle teacher and author, had conducted research for a book about the flood, but hadn't done it yet. Peg wrote a warm-hearted letter and since then has provided me assistance, encouragement, and friendship. Darla Phillips of Pendleton had been a neighbor 50 years ago. She called to offer research. The thing that keeps this grateful author awake at night is knowing that many of the stories people spent hours sharing and the old letters and pictures they unearthed for the project have dropped out of the book in one round of editing or another. I know that this will be disappointing to people whose family history is an interesting, important story. But the truth is that those memories and mementos are embedded in the book even if they are not individually evident. My understanding of what happened that day and the days before and after June 14, 1903 is a patchwork of information and stories generous people furnished me one piece at a time. Two examples. Dulcina Hughes Grover of Pendleton told of her crippled father's rescue from the Heppner Flood, and her cousin Tom Hughes of Fossil drove to Heppner and spent an afternoon showing me how the floodwaters menaced the family home. The text does not tell of 6-year-old William Jerry Hughes and his escape, but I can convey those terrifying minutes more accurately because I know the Hughes family experience and walked the ground the floodwaters scoured clean. Carrie Coughlin of Seattle revealed when she heard about this project that she had survived a flash flood in California. She subsequently devoted 2 evenings to describing the experience. Her story is not told in this book, but what I learned from her spreads invisibly through chapters 2, 3, and 4. My son Drew Gibbs and my dear friend and editor Gene Metzger read early drafts and made extraordinarily good suggestions. Mike Pride, a historian, newspaper editor, and friend, provided seasoned advice through the process, and after he carried a late draft to the beach, suggested breathtaking improvements. Pity there is not room on the book cover for all those names, nor for the names of these people whose assistance made such a difference. Mike Barber, Jan Thompson Beach, Bill and Robert Beckett, Janet Brandt, Verna Brinda, Dan and Doris Brosnan, Reverend Keith Brudevold, Don and Evelyn Campbell, Louis Carlson, Don and Nell Colburn, Gene Cook, Renee Devon, Ed Dick, John Edmondson, Nancy Erickson, Paul Fankhauser, Lee Firth, Margaret Flaherty, Mike and Steve Forrester, Katie Foster, Bob and Sharon Harrison, Bob Hart, Nancy Hott, Tom Hebert, Mark Higgins, Mark Heiberger, Kathleen Hissler, Bob Jepson, Lois Lanthorn, Sharon Lewis, Sylvia McDaniels, Vi Oliver, Barbara Orwick, Archie and Jeanette Padberg, Paul Robish, Alan M. Siegel, Stephanie Simmons, David and April Sykes, Solveig Torvik, Alfred and Cecilia Van Winkle, Thomas Vaughn, Steve Warren, Karen West, Doris Wilcox Graves, and Marguerite and Tom Wright. I am deeply indebted to Jerry Baldesty, professor, historian, and friend, who pored over multiple drafts and tutored me in the art of creating a book, and to Michael Duckworth at the University of Washington Press, who guided the project through its early incarnations. Particular thanks goes to Marianne Keddington Lang and Mary Rebeski, who have devoted so much energy to shepherding the book and its author to the goal, and to Sigrid Asmus, manuscript editor, whose keen eye saved readers from pages of literary errors and confusions. To my everlasting regret, 2 others who supported this book did not live to see the result of their considerable help. I met Nina Harshman in Heppner in 2005 and then repeatedly took advantage of her knowledge, openness, and good humor as she shared stories, photos, and the spirit of Morrow County. Alma Van Winkle Green, my aunt, and Cliff's mother, spent hours doing research and more hours finding records, letters, and photos, and graciously answering a stream of questions. Everyone who reads this book is fortunate that Alma turned her astute eye on an early draft. Finally, I will be forever grateful to Larry Lewin for the remarkable forbearance he has shown since his girlfriend morphed into an author, and for the hours he has devoted to translating technologies, calculating and checking every number in the book, and helping me think about the complexities of a flash flood. This is the book that generosity built. Introduction. The soil of Morrow County contains great riches if mixed with hard work, enterprise, and economy. From the Heppner Gazette of January 1st, 1903. Heppner, Oregon is a postcard of a town nestled at the base of the most gorgeous round hills you ever saw. 45 miles due south of the Columbia River, the town is on the dry, rural side of the state, on the way to recreation, fishing, and hunting in the Blue Mountains. There is no glittering entertainment down the highway that runs through Heppner, and it is not a big-time shopping destination. The Irish know it for the annual St. Patrick's Day weekend celebration, and rodeo fans have no trouble finding it every August. But otherwise, Heppner is not famous, even for its flood. The Heppner Flood was a flash flood, a sudden, unstoppable cliff of water and debris that surges through canyons and down river channels, crushing whatever and whomever gets in the way. On the hot afternoon of June 14, 1903, the flood took little more than an hour to claim the lives of 238 men, women, and children. Then it rolled downstream and poisoned the drinking water of 2 other communities. Heppner also lost 141 homes and 40 businesses, and of course hundreds of horses and cows, pigs and chickens, bowler hats, wagons, roses and churns, quilts, cradles, pies, and even entire cellars. In the countryside, farmers and ranchers mourned for acres and acres of topsoil for orchards and pasture. My father
was born and reared in Heppner, and my grandparents and my uncle's families lived there while I was growing up 60 miles away and spending many weekends and summer weeks in town. I suppose I had heard of the Heppner Flood. I remember the only time my father mentioned it, he was walking through his mother's living room in Heppner, where I stood idly holding the Gazette-Times 50th anniversary edition about the flood. Without stopping, he said something like, "I guess it was really awful." The single time my grandmother mentioned it came as we were working in her garden on the banks of Willow Creek, when she volunteered that 4 years before she and my grandfather moved west from Virginia in 1907, people had been swept away right there, just past the radishes. If my 10-year-old mind gave it one more thought, I must have figured if nobody was talking about it, it couldn't have amounted to much. The enormity of the event did not sink in until 2003, at the time of the flood centennial, when I read about the observance weekend and found Mark Heiberger's powerful book, Days of Sorrow. My inner newspaper reporter was compelled to find out more about who died that day
and why. The number of people who died in the Heppner Flood will never be known for certain. I hold the Heppner Flood responsible for about 245 deaths. About is a necessary qualifier because of the immediate after-flood chaos, the hurry to get bodies buried in the heat, the presence in town of maybe 50 visitors, the large number of children whom volunteers in the morgue couldn't recognize, and the frightful condition of the bodies. My research counts 238 killed directly by the flood. People I am sure were victims, including a woman who died 2 years later of her injuries. A handful I'm 99.9% certain about, the 14 travelers who never came back for their luggage, and who, so far as we know, never showed up elsewhere, and 27 whose bodies nobody could identify. I am adding 7 more people who would not have died there had there not been a Heppner Flood. They were living downstream from Heppner in Lexington, Ohio, and died of typhoid that autumn after their wells were contaminated in June. If my father didn't say much about the flood, he conveyed what I take to be routine thinking among people who lived in Heppner during his years there, and likely before him at the time of the Heppner Flood. Joe Green believed that there was no point brooding about things you couldn't change. Ruminating doesn't alter the facts, and it keeps you from getting your work done. The way Alfred Van Winkle put it in a 2005 interview was, "If you have adversity, face it and move on. It's like coming home from the war. You don't dwell on it. You do the next thing." For the longest time, people in Heppner only brought up the flood when they had to. As long as the survivors were alive, they must have been trying to banish what they saw and smelled and heard. Not thinking about the flood was no doubt a matter of self-discipline in the early years, and after a while, not bringing it up just came naturally. It was a long, long time before Heppner was inhabited by people removed enough from June 14, 1903, to begin to think intentionally about those losses and that day. It is these people, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who decided Heppner should formally acknowledge its most painful event. They created permanent public displays and a monument at the cemetery. They also imagined and pulled together the centennial observance that captured the attention of this retired newspaper editor. The Heppner Flood is a tragic story of nature versus human beings, with community, generosity, and determination coming to the rescue. But it is also a tale that includes two larger lessons. The first says, even the smallest things we do have consequences. In the decades and months before the flood, individual people acting independently routinely made changes to the environment around the streams flowing into Heppner. Some were minuscule, some gradual. Many people probably never thought any more about building their houses right beside the creeks. It was not any one person doing any one thing that made the town so vulnerable, but small acts accumulate. When the ordinary acts of many people were combined, a fairly typical June thunderstorm could create a flood that would take 245 lives. Small acts also added up right after the disaster. As soon as they heard of it, the men, women, and children of the Pacific Northwest raced to embrace Heppner with thousands of hours, dollars, and gestures of compassion. Governments, lodges, churches, clubs, businesses, and individuals sent money, often repeatedly, for Heppner relief. Hundreds of people came to work on cleanup, many walking from where the still usable railroad track ended 16 miles into the stricken town. Many of them worked from daylight to dark for $2 a day and then returned their wages to the Heppner Relief Committee. Around the state, actors, musicians, boxers, horsemen, and others with talent put on benefit performances. Together, thousands of contributions enabled Heppner to get back to being Heppner. Then, over the next century, individuals in Morrow County and at all levels of government, helped by big advances in science and technology, developed thousands of precautions that collectively give today's Heppner a fighting chance to prevent another flood as deadly as the one in 1903. The second story told by the Heppner Flood is about fortitude. A person apparently can overcome the most terrible losses imaginable if he or she is inclined to self-reliance and optimism and has already been through hell. Many who survived the flood had either walked from the Midwest to Oregon or were the children and grandchildren of people who did. On the frontier, men and women built lives and livelihoods with sweat and enterprise. They were self-sufficient optimists, confident that good luck was the result of hard work. Survivors who buried spouses and children after the flood had done it before, maybe more than once. In 1903, premature death was a constant. Parents knew they would bury babies. Husbands died in farming accidents and wives in childbirth. Everyone might succumb to a list of diseases that hadn't yet been tamed. Diphtheria and tuberculosis were common. Clean water, refrigeration, and doctors were not. Being alive at the beginning of the 20th century was a dangerous business.